Okay, hello everybody, and thanks for joining us. Sorry, I'm a little bit late getting started here. I sent out the email today with the PowerPoint package, which I'm going to be discussing. If not today, certainly by Wednesday. If you look at the syllabus, we were to have covered through Chapter 11 for the next exam. We're probably not going to get there. In fact, as I was looking at it, it seemed to me really that rather than just trying to gallop along at a ridiculously fast pace, I would rather take a little bit more leisurely and finish up Chapter 8, dealing with perfect competition, and then getting into Chapter 9, dealing with monopoly. And I think that that's going to be really enough for us to sort of cut that off there for our next exam, which is going to be next week. I think it's a little bit more bite-sized, a little more manageable. We did lose a little bit of time this semester due to a holiday, and also to I think we had a snow day in there at some point, so we're maybe a little bit behind, but not too much. And I know pretty much at what pace we need to run in order to cover the main topics that will get you the requisite background and micro for you to continue on with your studies. And so today, which begins week 10, we're going to cover the rest of Chapter 8, dealing with perfect competition. Of those four structures, perfect competition is sort of one that sort of sits out by itself. Remember, we talked about the fact that of the four structures, we had perfect competition as the first of these, and then we had its polar opposite, which was monopoly, which we're going to perhaps get into today. If we don't get into it today, we certainly will on Wednesday, and we'll cover that, and we'll probably keep talking about it on Monday of next week, and then we'll review for the exam, which will be held next Wednesday, and that exam will be available in class for you to take, or you can take it at the testing center again, or you can do it on Brightspace, which will be available from after class on Wednesday through Sunday evening, same as before. So of these four structures, perfect competition, monopoly, then we have this weird hybrid here. I guess it's not that weird, but it's unusual in the sense that we've sort of built up the differences and the contrasts between perfect competition and monopoly, and then we've got a hybrid of both of those two. So we'll talk about how that can happen. It really has to do with the time frame, which is why we spend so much time talking about the short run versus the long run. One of the things that these three structures have in common is that they can be defined by what they're not, and that what they're not is perfect competition. And so we basically refer to them as imperfect competition. And I know that occasionally you may run across material online, or the textbooks that we'll talk about these last two guys as being imperfect competition, but in reality, all three of these are imperfectly competitive because they don't have the same characteristics of perfect competition. So that will do it. By the time we come back from our third exam, we'll cover monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and that's and then the next chapter coming after that will deal with some regulatory pieces, which then take us then to the third of those actor groups. Remember, we talked a bit about the economics of households in terms, particularly as in their role as utility maximizers. And we're talking here in this section about business firms as profit maximizers. Then we'll talk a bit about government's role as social welfare maximizers. And all the ways in which government seeks to maximize the most benefit for the most people throughout the economy. And obviously, whatever government does is going to be controversial. And so you can see that it's really difficult to talk about econ without getting into some of the political aspects, which are unavoidable. No question about it. They're always unavoidable. And there's always something government does that someone's not happy about, and someone would prefer to go differently, go their way perhaps, but that's just the way life is. And so when we have governments, elected governments, and enough of us don't like what they're doing, we can simply change our local, state, and federal governments. Okay, so that's what we'll do. So we'll cut off the exam for Chapter 9. It'll be the same format as before, and then we'll spend about 45 minutes on Monday, a week from today, reviewing for the third exam. So I know we just took one a couple weeks ago. They're coming a little bit faster now, but at least the material is more bite-sized, a little bit less reading material that goes into it. Okay. All right. So are there questions for me? It doesn't look like we have too many people on the call or on the Zoom link at this point, but that's okay. And we'll be here, and obviously this will be available. It'll be posted and available for everyone's consumption at some point. So I'm going to go ahead and erase this, and I'm going to talk about some of the things where we ended up last time, we were talking a bit about how we view perfect competition. And it's the only one of the four structures in which we view it in sort of a split screen mode. And I did this last time, and so you probably don't necessarily have to reproduce this in your notes unless you want to. But we've got the market itself. And by the way, I'll come back to something I've talked about before, and that is the idea that the word market here is going to be used interchangeably with the term industry. And the term industry should be construed as that particular competitive environment in which a business firm operates. And so I know that in the business world, we tend to think of people, we throw around the word market, and sometimes they might be referring to, if you're a business person, you might be referring to the market for, I don't know, camping gear, right? And they might be referring strictly to the demand side. And in the context of a conversation, it might be completely obvious they're talking about the demand side. Or if you're looking to buy tickets to the Super Bowl and you're on StubHub or one of those kind of places, you might be talking about the market as being the supply side. That is who is trying to supply it, and therefore that defines the market for you. In either context, we understand the market in that particular relevant discussion. However, in economics, we're talking about both sides of the market, supply and demand both. And so as a result, the market itself is that setting in which demand and supply come together. And we have seen this before. This is not something new, this configuration. And the market here is to be used interchangeably with industry, because now we're talking about really the competitive ecosystem in which firms find themselves. And so we use the term market structure, industry structure, interchangeably. They will be the same thing, okay? So the split screen view is taking the market on one hand and then taking the view of the individual firm on the other hand. And it is a convention in economics that we tend to take big things and put capital letters in the smaller things if we're talking about big versus small, particularly in micro with smaller letters. And so this would be the individual market, or the market, or this would be the situation facing the individual firm. So the interplay of supply and demand gives us some equilibrium price, and that equilibrium price carries over, and the firm will take the price, and that will be its demand curve. Okay, so we haven't introduced the supply side yet, but we're going to here in just a second. So what is the thing that we should know about this is the fact that the firm itself, remember, we go back to the characteristics. This goes to the slide package for week 9, in which we talk about perfect competition and some of the characteristics. And one of those, let me see which one it is. That is fourth one down. 1, 2, 3. Fourth one down. No one seller can influence the market price. In other words, they're price takers. Now, this is going to differ quite substantially from the next structure we'll be talking about with monopoly, where we say those firms are price makers. So we have price makers and price takers. In this case, we're dealing with price takers, and that is the firms themselves are price takers, not the market. The market is simply what the market is. It's the interplay of demand and supply forming an equilibrium price, which is, again, a short-term condition of balance. And the term short-term is something that we should not lose sight of, because there are always going to be shifts in demand, shifts in supply, or perhaps government controls on prices, where government will say, we're going to prop the price up by putting it up here. And so now the sellers will go along with that price because that's the price that they're given. Or we're going to restrict the price by putting it down here, and sellers are going to have to deal with that price simply because of the fact that there is a government stricture. So there are always going to be changes over here that are going to impact things over here. And one of the themes of perfect competition that I'm going to hope to make clear here is the idea that these people here are sort of along for the ride. They really are. It's a difficult and sort of tenuous existence for these producers. They find themselves vacillating between economic profit and non-economic profit, and in other words, losses. And so that becomes quite difficult for them. And one final bit before we bring in the supply side here is the idea that the demand curve is tantamount to being the same thing as the marginal revenue curve. And remember what marginal revenue is. Marginal revenue is simply incremental revenue, that is the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. And we'll use the quantity variable here as opposed to total product, which is how we sort of began this discussion of the supply side of goods, that is the market structure, only because of the fact that we're bringing demand and supply both together. And Q here is the quantity exchanged in a market. So, but it's one of the same. And we went through an exercise last week where I think I said the price was 5 all the way down. I just sort of gave a hypothetical example of different quantities, and the demand and marginal revenue were the same, or the price and marginal revenue were the same. And that's an important consideration here, price and marginal revenue. Now, it might seem obvious, well, why would price and marginal revenue be the same? If I sell 5 units at $5, then per unit, that's $5 per unit. And what is complicated about that? Well, let's hold on, because what's complicated about that is that there's one single price that these firms are taking, and that price will change over time. But here's the thing: when we compare perfect competition to monopolistic competition, and to oligopoly, we're going to see that there are a variety of different prices that can be charged. Not just one price, because those sellers are not really considered to be price takers, especially not monopolies, who are really the complete opposite, as we'll see in a minute. And by the way, I went ahead and emailed you the package for the PowerPoint package. I don't know if I mentioned that a minute ago, for week 10, which is just monopoly. And one of the reasons I got a bit of a late start here is because as I was looking this over, I was at my office, and I had put in monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and I thought, okay, I'll just dump it all in there so it's there in one place. And I thought, you know, I'd rather not do that, because I'd rather just wait and in week 12 then pull in monopolistic competition, oligopoly, because I don't really want people necessarily to fixate on having material in front of them that they're not going to need for the exam. I think that's better that way. So I just sort of tailored it. I had to cut some things out, but I went ahead and emailed it to everybody so it's there now, so you can take a look at that. Again, we still haven't resolved the issue with the sort of double vision on the PowerPoints in Brightspace. I don't know what that's about, but nonetheless, it is what it is. And so I just thought it was easier to go ahead and email it to you once they were available. Okay, so this is where we left off last time, essentially, was this idea of a business firm producing output at whatever the market price was given to them, simply because of the fact that the market itself creates the prices, and therefore the prices are taken. And I think we went through a bit of an exercise last time as well, where we did some shifting. I think maybe it was the demand curve that shifted to the right, and then as a result, it brought the price up. And so the demand and marginal revenue curve would go up as well. So we're going to come back to that. Only I'm going to shift the supply side. So what I'm going to focus on mostly today with regard to perfect competition is the supply side. And that is this: we haven't brought the supply side into the market yet. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and bring supply in. So we've got a supply curve which is upward sloping, which is what we would expect it to be. But guess what? Here is the thing. What is marginal cost? What is the definition of marginal cost? If you think back to where we came from, it's the change in total cost divided by the change in total product or quantity, whichever you prefer, right? Again, even when we were using total product as the variable for that particular denominator, I said that they're pretty much analogous, but we sort of focused on total product mostly because it was a supply construct only. Here we're putting demand and supply together, so it's probably just easier to refer to this as Q in both cases of these marginals. So marginal cost is the incremental cost. Remember the term marginal, if we go back to this discussion that we had a while ago, where we said there are 3 kinds of values that we deal with in economics. We have totals, which are pretty obvious, they're just simply aggregates of whatever the observations, the data points are. We have averages, which are, in this case, just simple averages, total values of all the observations added together, divided by the number of observations. Pretty simple there. And marginals. Marginals are a little bit trickier because they operate as we go from one incremental level to the next, from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, etc. So it's incremental cost is what we're talking about. In other words, the change in total cost as we produce more output. And that's upward sloping. Well, what is the supply curve, but really a marginal cost curve in this particular case? So the supply curve and the marginal cost curve are one and the same. And so we've got a parallel going on here. The demand curve and marginal in perfect competition is the same as the marginal revenue curve, and the supply curve is the same as the marginal cost curve. And so we've got this particular sort of linkage going on there. Okay? So the supply curve really is a cost curve. It really is a cost curve. And so what can we say then about marginal revenue and marginal cost? In fact, what can we say about any firm in any industry? We'll go back to the PowerPoint package that we produced for last week. That was the microeconomics week 9. And the very last item when it talks about characteristics of perfect competition is that the profit maximizing quantity is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. This is a key attribute of what's going on here because it really describes what's happening in economics from the standpoint of how do we produce output and at what level do we produce output. So here's the thing. So we said that firms in perfect competition can produce as much output as they like, but they're going to take whatever price is given to them because the market price is what the market price is. So P star over here, capital P star, is the same as P star here, only it's given at whatever that particular market price is. So the firm can't change that. They can't make any moves to sort of alter the price. And the reasons for this are very simple. There's nothing the firm can do to alter the market price. They can't interfere in the market somehow. They can't produce less output and thereby drive the price up. They're one of maybe thousands of producers of oat, wheat, barley, corn, timber, coal, whatever. There may not be thousands of coal producers, but you get the idea that when we talk about these goods as being commoditized products, what was it that we were talking about? We're saying that these goods are the same. They're interchangeable, that a ton of coal produced in West Virginia is pretty much the same as a ton of coal produced in Kentucky. Now, could a scientist examine those two lumps of coal, those 2 tons of coal and say, this came from West Virginia, this came from Kentucky? Probably, but does the demand side perceive it? No, not really. And so as a result, these goods are what these goods are. So individual sellers really can't do anything about it. They can't say, I'm going to go on strike, not produce output, and we'll show you because it will just drive the price up. It's not going to happen. If you want to produce, produce. If you don't want to produce, don't produce. The reality is that it's got to be a concerted effort in order to have an influence on the market. And there are just too many producers for that to happen. And there have been really no instances that I can certainly think of as an economic historian in which producers of goods in perfectly competitive industries have gotten together to coordinate their actions on the supply side in order to sort of rig the price of the good. And the example that I gave last time was a bit of evidence to support that view, because even the OPEC oil cartel, which is only a couple dozen producing countries, can't get it together to control the price because there's always somebody cheating. If they decide they want to withhold supply, pushing the supply curve to the left, somebody's going to sort of cheat and produce more output in order to take advantage of those high prices, thereby weakening the overall mission that they've agreed on in the first place. Now, that behavior is called collusion, and we're going to be talking about that much more in with the next 3 market structures. What is absent in perfect competition is that ability to collude. It just doesn't really exist because the market is too fragmented and there's no mechanism, there's no coordination mechanism by which producers can get together and say, hey, let's all agree on a particular price. And actually how they would do it is they would agree on a particular output level. And by agreeing on the output level, they would agree on the price. So the only decision is along this vector here, and that is the quantity vector, and that is how much to produce. So one of the things that we talked about in the very last item here, as I mentioned, was this idea of the profit maximizing quantity, which we're going to refer to as the variable Q pi max. Pi is the symbol that we use everywhere in macroeconomics or microeconomics for profit maximizing quantity. It's only an output decision that these firms are having to make here. I guess I'll put a little small q here since we are talking about the micro model. And it's the point at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And I would get to know this and be comfortable with that. That is a very important relationship for reasons that we'll talk about. In fact, it doesn't even only limit itself to discussions of perfect competition. It's also got applicability to the other structures as well. But we will get to the other structures when we get to them. Let's just continue our discussion of perfect competition. And let's see what what this looks like when we get a condition in which marginal revenue is not equal to marginal cost, and what the firm will do in this particular case. And so let's say the firm is producing an output level here, okay? In other words, here, what do we have? We have marginal revenue being greater than marginal cost. Marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. So in other words, what's happening? Well, you've got a condition in which for every unit of output you produce, you're getting more back than what it's costing you to produce. It's a pretty good situation. Think about this. If you put a quarter in a slot machine, and every time you put a quarter in, $1 came out, what would you do? Well, you put more quarters in, you keep doing it. Every time you put a quarter in, $1 comes out. And maybe you put $1 in, maybe a quarter in, and then 99 cents comes out. Well, you'll still keep producing. The next time you put a quarter in, 98 cents, 97, 96, until you get to 26 cents. But you're going to continue putting quarters in until you get 25 cents back, right? Because there's no point in putting more dollars in. Now, I know it's not quite as easy as that, but it's a pretty good analogy that I think we can all relate to. I mean, if business were no more difficult than simply putting money in a slot machine and getting money back, then what would be the point? It would not be the great exertion that we're all talking about here. But it's the idea of payback. And that is, if you're getting more per unit than what it's costing you, then what should you do? You should produce more output. Produce more output. So in this regard, whatever the quantity is, we'll call it Q prime, the seller ought to produce more because they're earning more per unit than what it's costing them per unit. So as a result, the impetus then is to provide more output. What about the other condition here? What if you're producing way out on this axis here? In fact, you could argue that you're overproducing, right? In other words, here, marginal revenue is less than marginal cost. So here, you're putting a quarter in, and you're getting 10 cents back. And it's like, oh my gosh, maybe I should do less of this. You put a quarter in, now you're getting 9 cents back, and you're getting 8 cents back. The more you go out on this axis here, you're getting less and less back. In other words, you're diminishing the earnings that you already had here. Remember, this whole region here then could really be talked about as profit, right? This is profit per unit. So as a result of this, every amount that you go into this region here, you're actually taking away what you've already gained. And so as a result, what should the seller do? The seller should dial it down and go in this direction. So at this output level, we'll call Q double prime, we should produce less output. So where should we stop? Well, we ought to stop right here at the output level in which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Because that is the point at which we've gotten all the profit per unit out of the system of our production. And so as a result, there's no more profit to be had per unit. Given this very short run condition of whatever the demand and price and marginal revenue are. So as a result, and again, we're talking about cost here. We're talking about economic cost, that is costs which presumably include also the implicit costs of production, which we don't really know what they are in this case. We're just assuming that we have accounted for them in this particular example. So it could be, remember when we talked about implicit cost, we talked about the idea that it could be, when we're talking about a specific example, that it's the next best alternative that you could be doing. So if this is a producer of corn, for instance, maybe the best alternative they could be doing is producing something like alfalfa. And as a result, maybe giving it the value of alfalfa would be included as a marginal cost here. So we're saying this is economic profit. Okay, and so that's a good thing, obviously, but that's marginal profit per unit. That's not total profit altogether. And so for us to understand that, let's do this. Let's bring in the other two elements of cost. And that is the idea of, and I'll just use a different graphic. This will be for the firm itself. So we're not talking about the market here. We're talking about the firm itself. And so a different graph here, it's going to be this, where we've got P and Q, okay? And we've got some demand / marginal revenue curve going on here. So demand, again, doesn't look exactly horizontal. And by the way, we say this is horizontal because it's perfectly elastic. If you go back to chapter 5, we talked about what that is. We say that the firm can produce as much output as it likes, but the demand side is perfectly sensitive to it. So if the market price is what the market price is, then any ability to price any amount higher, there is no point that aligns with the demand curve. And so as a result, there won't be any demand. There'll be no quantity demand at that particular price. And so as a result, the firm will be stuck with that. Okay. All right. So there's the demand curve. And we're going to talk about the supply curve, coming in here like that, supply and marginal cost looking something like that. Okay. So here's the thing. Let's say that we've got a condition in which we have got this going on, where we have average total cost, which looks something like this. Average total cost. Remember what average total cost is. Average total cost is the cost per unit at any particular point of production, right? And so that's what average total cost is. So if you think about what's going on here, let's look at this condition. Again, the firm is going to produce the output level, which marginal revenue is marginal cost. That's going to be here. But here is the average total cost curve, which means all of this shaded area here is economic profit. That's the shaded area. It's economic profit. In other words, it's a positive economic profit. And the reason it's positive is because price is greater than average total cost. So if you consider this here, if you've got price that's greater than average total cost, remember what this is. This is the price per unit, right? Which is the exchange value of output per unit, right? Exchange value of output per unit versus the average cost of inputs per unit, then you've got what? If it's greater than that, you've got a positive economic profit. A positive economic profit, and that's considered to be a good thing. Okay? Positive economic profit is a good situation. Here's the problem, though, with positive economic profit. It doesn't always last, and we're gonna talk about that in a minute. What's the other element here that we can that's sort of related to this? And it would be this. What if we have a different condition where, and I'll just go ahead, I'll leave this guy up here because I think that's important. That's why I've sort of put a little frame around that. So what if we have a different condition here where we've got another PQ play? These are for the firms again, so that's why we're using small letters. We've got a demand and marginal revenue curve right here, demand and marginal revenue, and you've got a marginal cost curve or supply marginal cost curve looking something like that. But now you got the average total cost curve here. So this is the average total cost curve. So again, the firm is always going to produce output level, which marginal revenue is marginal cost. Remember, that's the profit maximizing level of output. Over here, they're going to produce at that output level. So remember, the decision for perfectly competitive firms is not about price, it's about output. It's how much output or how little output the firm is going to produce. So the firm is going to produce this level of output always, 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 because that is the profit maximizing quantity. But here's the problem. There's a difference between average total cost and price here, and that is the condition of an economic loss. In other words, a negative economic profit. So just the opposite condition here, where now price is less than average total cost, and that is a negative economic profit, also known as an economic loss. Oops, or economic loss. So that's not good, obviously. And so you might say, well, why would a firm want to operate in a condition in which they're operating at an economic loss? Well, it could be that, well, remember, these are very short-run conditions. And it could be that the price is just artificially low at the particular moment, but it will catch up, once things change and whatnot. So particularly, there are a lot of markets in which prices fluctuate a lot. And one of the examples that I think we all can relate to is that of gasoline. Gasoline is obviously a derivative of oil. And if you look at what happens to oil prices at all times, not just in this particular economic crisis that was brought on by the war in Eastern Europe, but at all times, you could say the price of oil is pretty much sort of volatile, kind of bounces up and down. And we've been seeing this for year after year after year. And the reason why is it's a commoditized product. And because it's a commoditized product, the price fluctuates. And it's a global market. You've got actors coming in, going out, coming in, going out. And as a result, the supply curve is shifting to the right, shifting to the left, forcing the prices to be different. And by the way, I think we were even talking in class about the fact that the price of oil had sort of spiked to $130 per barrel in the wake of Russia's military involvement in Ukraine. And today it's around just a little over $100 per barrel. It's fallen quite a lot. And that's how volatile the price of oil is. I think there was a lot of concern over the fact that there wouldn't be as much oil on the market because Russia is a big oil producer, and the industrial world pretty much unanimously was trying to shut down some of the supply of that. Europeans are not quite there yet, but President Biden announced last week that the U.S. would not import oil that is known to have come from Russia. Now it's always a weird thing to say, how do we know it comes from Russia? Because it does go into sort of a global refining chain. So it's a little bit difficult. It's the same that we tried with Iraq and Iran at various times. We're not going to buy their oil, and it sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't, but you kind of get the idea. The point is, though, that the price fluctuates. The price fluctuates really because of supply. So think about this. One of the things that we talked about, and it goes back to the PowerPoint slides that we first talked about back in last week, was the idea of the price being equivalent to marginal revenue being perfectly elastic. It was the fact that economic profit is possible in the short run, but in the long run, we're assuming that the economic profit is assumed to be zero. Now let's talk about why that is the case. And it really has to do, I guess I will have to sort of erase this here in order to make my point. So we've got two examples of and we can call it the same firm. It doesn't really make any difference. Let's just say it's the same firm, but a different sort of cost situation going on. And but let's say that what happens is this. So now here you've got the market now, okay? So this is the market or the industry. And what will tend to happen to this is this. You've got no one's at level of demand and supply, so you've got supply, and you've got global demand for whatever the good in question is. You've got price and quantity, and you've got some equilibrium price going on. So the equilibrium price is whatever the equilibrium price is. And I guess I should probably, create a situation where this is a little bit more in line with these guys over here. Let me draw this a little bit more realistically, I guess. There's demand, and let's say, let's take supply, and let's say it cuts the cost here, okay? And so we have a price that looks like that, okay? Market price looks like that. Okay, so let's take a condition where we've got this going on. We've got positive economic profit. And let's think again about all these characteristics of perfect competition that make it what it is. And that is, it's price. The firms are price takers. They can't do anything individually to influence the price. All they can do is influence their output decisions. That is, their supply decision is the only decision that they have to make. But also, what was one of the things that we talked about? In fact, we spent quite a lot of time talking about the definitions of barriers to entry. And we're saying there are low barriers to entry. It doesn't take much to get into this particular market. So if this is a market in which firms are operating where the price that they're getting per unit exceeds the cost per unit, then why not produce more output? And why not get into that particular market, particularly if barriers to entry are low? And if you think about the market for oil, I think it's a good example. There are all kinds of firms over many decades that make their living by simply chasing oil prices when they're high, by going out and exploring, finding oil, drilling as much oil as possible, working 24 hours a day or something like that, just to pump as much as possible in order to get that high price, because the price exceeds the cost of production, and just raking in the money while it's there to be made. And when the price falls, because what happens? If you've got people entering a market, what ends up happening? That supply goes from some S1 to some S2, and it ends up bringing the price down. Nothing encourages competition than people making profits, particularly when barriers to entry are low. So as firms come in, and now everyone starts drilling, then there's more oil on the market and the price falls. And when the price falls, then we get back to the point at which we have zero economic profit. And then the price keeps falling because people keep coming, that is, suppliers keep coming. And as a result, the price falls to a point at which now firms are losing money. And so then they do what? Then they exit the market and they go this direction. And then the price pops up again. And so as a result, we have some new equilibrium price, all of which are simply influenced by entry and exit. So this would be an example here of entry. And this would be an example of exit. Entry of what? Entry of firms. Exit of what? Exit of firms into the market itself in order to chase the high price. Or to chase the high price when it's high. So, and oil drilling is a perfect example of this, where firms will take their equipment out of storage and they'll simply go. Maybe they have existing long-term leases on large tracts of property, like in the Bakken or lots of area. Even here in New Mexico, we've got lots of drillers, independent or affiliated with bigger companies, doesn't matter. And they go out, take their equipment out of storage and start drilling in order to get that high price. And when everybody else starts doing it, then the price falls. And we know that we've seen this, the pump gas prices going up, down, up, down, up, down. And so once more drillers come in, they produce more oil, then the price falls. And then the price falls to a point at which nobody's making money and firms leave. And as they leave, it pops back up. But until that happens, though, because there's so many people coming in here with entry, that firms are going to eventually have to leave the market. And they simply pack up their hardware, put it in storage, lay the workers off, and they're done for now. And they ride out another cycle. We see this happening again and again and again. And it goes on a lot. And it's sort of accelerated too, because of the technology of what's called fracking has made it even easier and cheaper, and has allowed drillers to get at deposits that were difficult to get at otherwise. And fracking is simply a play on the words, a play on the word fracturing. It's called hydraulic fracturing, where drillers will shoot hot water and chemicals into the ground and sort of break up rock to get at the shale underneath in order to get at oil deposits, and it's called fracking. And we do a lot of it here. It's been going on for about 100 years, but we've heard a lot about it in the last few years because of just the overwhelming amount of fracking that's been going on, particularly here in the Western United States, and how some people believe that it's responsible for things like earthquakes or earth tremors because it's sort of unsettling the ground underneath us. And so that's a whole other geological discussion that will have to sort of evade my attention. But the point is that we're vacillating between economic profit and economic loss. If profits are high, firms come in. As firms come in, they drive the price down. So now everyone's losing money. As firms begin to lose money, firms exit again. And so as a result, what we're saying is in the long run, the economic profit is zero. And this is the important thing to know, is that long run economic profit in perfect competition, I think I just drive that marker out there, is zero. Long run economic profit is zero. And zero is this sort of what we would call a zero profit equilibrium. That's a long run condition where firms vacillate between profit, loss, profit, loss, profit, loss. And so as a result, firms will operate at these particular junction points over and over and over again. Okay? And this is what makes life difficult for producers. And by the way, we'll talk about some examples of these firms. And I'm like, why don't we do that now? I've already alluded to some of them. And so the first was agricultural output, where I said that agricultural output is really a perfect fit for this. And in fact, most econ textbooks that you'll come across where there's a discussion of examples of perfectly competitive industries, almost anything connected with agriculture is considered to be a case of perfect competition, where the prices are all over the place. Now, the last few years, we've seen high prices for things like beef and pork and things like that. It's mostly because of the fact that the demand is pushing it up. It's not even a supply issue, it's demand is pushing the price of those particular goods up, and the supply side can't catch up. There's just no way for the supply side to catch up, and so the price is high. So that's a good thing, right? So beef producers are obviously probably going through some pretty good times. Not perfect times, and they would obviously want to produce as much as they can at that higher price. But there have been times when that price has fallen. And I'm not even talking about introducing the inflationary picture that is the macro story right now, where prices in general are rising. I'm simply saying the price for that particular market has seen increases, mostly because of demand issues. But there are also sometimes supply issues, One of the classic examples that econ textbook writers will talk about is something like a freeze in oranges, where, and we see this every year. I mean, it's almost impossible to go through a winter without hearing on the news that there's a freeze in Florida and the orange crop is in danger. And as a result, what happens is there's a shift to the left of supply, which brings the market price of oranges up. And so it's like, well, be careful now, watch out, because the price of orange juice is going to be more expensive, etc. Well, this happens every year. Most every year. Although this year, I don't know that I've heard that story actually. So I guess my point is a little bit watered down a little bit, but you get the idea that it often happens where there's a freeze in Florida, and as a result, some of the orange crop is destroyed. The farmers can't get out there, even though they try to put out space heaters to work to keep the oranges healthy and growing. That doesn't always work. Here's the thing: if you're a producer and that you're not affected because maybe the freeze line is just above where your crops are located, that higher price, that elevated price that pushes it above your cost of production, is going to be good for you. So as a result, you experience what's known as economic luck. Economic luck, and I think that's one of the points that I made in the PowerPoint package. Economic luck is, and it sounds like I'm just making this term up out of thin air, but it's really a real thing. It's the idea that sometimes economic actors simply get lucky. And so if you're a producer in Florida and you're producing maybe south of Ocala County, and everything up north of that is just frozen, and the oranges are being wiped out, orange crops are being wiped out, but you're okay because you're a little further south and you're able to get your space heaters out there and whatnot, then you're going to be along for the ride, and you're going to take that higher price. You're going to take it because you're a price taker. You have no choice, but why wouldn't you take it? On the other hand, what if you, what if there were just an abundance of oranges? In other words, what we call a bumper crop. Everybody's producing oranges, and so as a result, the price falls because there's too many oranges. You're going to take that price too, particularly if you're already committed to that particular price. And by the way, I know that this sort of leads us into a discussion which I don't want to go too far into, but that leads us into the futures market for commoditized goods, which is a market that's been around for well over 100 years. It allows producers of these commoditized items, whether it's corn, oranges, soybeans, orange juice, even coffee, sugar, wheat, cotton, oats, barley, and it goes on and on. These commodities, where you can look them up in the Wall Street Journal, you can go on the financial websites, where producers will lock in their price as a forward price, knowing that they're going to get that price guaranteed if they can deliver those goods by X day. So corn for November delivery or whatever, and they lock in the price. Now, if the price goes up between now and November, they don't get that higher price. But if the price goes down, they're still guaranteed to get that price. And that market has been very efficient to allow producers to at least have the certainty of knowing that as long as they can deliver the product, then they're guaranteed a price by the delivery date. As long as they can produce the product in the quantity at the delivery date, they'll get that price. And by the way, producers often have crop insurance as well. Some of it government subsidized. Again, we bring in the role of government here because the government's long had a involvement in agricultural output. So you might say, well, how can farmers lose? Well, they can lose because they can be stuck with low prices. Even the prices they lock in are low. And because they have to produce whatever that crop is because of natural needs to need to rotate their crops, they might have to produce corn in a year and the corn price is very low because there's too much corn being produced. So you get the idea. It's a very interesting set of circumstances. And all of these commodity goods, which we had talked about, and again, you can go on to any of the financial websites to see these commodity markets of things like oats and barley and cocoa and sugar and flax, whatever flax is. And they're all just commodity items that are produced, and the prices fluctuate, mostly because of global supply and demand issues. So agriculture is a perfect example. Also, timber is another example of this. And it's kind of interesting that you see these television shows now with lumberjacks and all the pressure that they're under to deliver timber by certain times and dates, trying to catch high prices when they're there. We have seen timber prices be pretty elevated in the last few years, especially post-pandemic. Lots of theories on it. Number one, supply issues, not producing as much supply because of the overall sort of macro condition where people are not supplying as much because of labor shortages and whatnot. but also demand. I mean, a lot of people have pointed to the fact that a lot of people who have been homebound have decided, hey, let's add a room on while we're all here during the pandemic. And so there's been sort of upsurge in some of that, at least has been the thinking has been responsible for that. So we've seen high timber prices, but they're not always guaranteed forever, because those high prices are also going to encourage more supply. Fishing, mineral production, we talked a bit about coal and oil there. Low value output, this is an interesting one. This is mostly consumer goods that have low value, and they simply trade like commodities. Think about a lot of the goods that you would buy like at a place like Dollar Tree or Dollar General. And I'm not talking about with brand name goods like Glad trash bags or Reynolds Wrap. Those are clearly a little bit different. We're going to talk about those kinds of goods when we get to monopolistic competition a bit later, a couple weeks from now. But instead, think about goods like particularly the kitchenware stuff, which is where I sort of go to when I go to Dollar General. You can find things like pot holders and spatulas and spaghetti strainers and whatever. I mean, all these kinds of things that you use in the kitchen that you don't really have to have a brand name in order to feel good about your purchase. It doesn't have to be called Rubbermaid or whatever the brand name is. You simply want to buy the good because it's inexpensive. That's low value output. I mean, if it sells for $1, that's pretty low value, right? But all this low value stuff, the prices fluctuate, they go up, they go down. Lots of producers produce those particular goods. And it does seem like there is a sort of permanent depression of prices on those, just simply because of the large volume of output that we see being produced in some of those low, that low value output. Now, the goal obviously would be, if you're a seller, to try to create a condition in which, okay, this spatula is a little bit different than other spatulas, and so as a result, you should buy this spatula. And there have been cases in which that has happened. Tupperware is a good example of a firm that has made its product seem unique and special, and therefore it's just plastic bins and lids, but people do pay a higher price for it. And we've had a unique supply chain over the years of so-called Tupperware parties, where people get together in order to buy Tupperware from a dealer, usually just a person who sells Tupperware. That would be an example of a firm that's trying to put a brand on its goods in order to get a higher price, and to get brand recognition, and to get brand loyalty. And we're going to talk much more about brands. What are some of the other examples? Would be any kind of low value output that would be of a retail sort of nature, like personal services and whatnot. These are producers that don't charge very much for what they do, and as a result, they're sort of competing with other firms. And you can't imagine there's much economic profit being made in places like dry cleaning, dog grooming, nail salons, that sort of thing. I'm not saying that they're not making a profit, not making a living, because they are. Nobody would do that if they weren't making a living. But because keep in mind, economic profit is always going to be less than accounting profit, because economists will dump into that the implicit costs, that is the opportunity cost of the next best alternative that exists. And so as a result, economic profit might be zero or negative, but there might be positive accounting profit, meaning that those firms are hanging on, they're able to pay the bills, keep the lights on, but they're just not earning positive economic profit year after year after year, mostly because of the fact that this is not something where there's oftentimes lots of loyalty on the part of customers. It's really hard to brand yourself. These are not considered to be, I want to be careful because I know everyone knows hairdressers and dog groomers, but I guess they're not considered to be professions in the sense that you're willing to pay lots of money for. Like you're willing to pay a lawyer or a doctor. You're not really willing to pay all that much for those particular services. And, and I get that they're trained and they're licensed and all that good stuff, and they do good work and all. But you get the idea that there are a lot of these producers and they're competing against one another, and that when things go awry, a lot of them go under. In fact, the lady that used to cut my hair went out of business during the pandemic. I don't know where she is, and so we've been kind of bouncing around. My wife has been looking for guys to do my hair and my son and all that. So you kind of get the idea that exit is also possible. Remember, barriers to entry are low, barriers to exit are low. Come in and go, come in and go, and that's really the issue. That's really the process behind this zero profit equilibrium, this long run equilibrium condition of entry and exit, entry and exit. Okay. All right. So I don't know how many people have got on the line here because it looks like my screen's kind of blacked out. But I want to do one more thing here before we move on to Monopoly. And we'll just sort of introduce Monopoly a bit today, and then we'll cover it a bit more on Wednesday and then a bit more again on Monday. And that is this. There are a couple of points worth thinking about. And the first of these is this idea of economic profit and loss, which we've already began talking about here. So if you've got a condition in which price equals average total cost, we simply refer to that as a break-even point. Okay, a break-even point. In other words, you're exactly covering your costs. The break-even point. And the break-even point is interesting. And for those of you who will go on to study accounting and finance, you will come back to this again and again. This is what makes micro particularly relevant to those who are looking to study other business courses. In fact, even I think in marketing, I'm definitely not a marketing person, but I think in marketing, there's discussion of the break-even point. And that is, at what level of production do we need to get to break even? And this is very often a decision that's made. That is, what happens if we only break even? If we only do this, then at least we get to break even. And that sometimes is an important consideration. It's sometimes called a pre-mortem. That is not post-mortem, but pre-mortem. That's like, how do we decide something is a failure if all we do is we get to break even? Now, I know in finance, if you take corporate finance, they will say that as long as you're making $1 above break even, it's not quite that simple. I'm sort of simplifying a little bit because there are some time value of money considerations I'm not getting into that deals with finance. But they're saying if it's $1, you should do that thing, whatever that thing is. In reality, I know that I had lunch one time with our CFO, the bank that I was working for, and he said, he was thinking about this. If it's $1, do I want to do that? Is that the best I can do? Is $1 if I'm going to enter a new market or create a new product? Is that the best I can do? Do I want to go to my bosses and say, we're going to make $1 and that's all I expect to earn? No. If it turns out it's $1, then that's another thing. But we need to be shooting a little bit higher here. So you kind of get the idea that break even, it's better than nothing. It's better than negative profit, which is a loss, but it's not exactly where the firm wants to be. But here's another thing that I'm going to talk about, which is a little bit mystifying to people, but it's important that we talk about here, and that is this, that we've got all these different combinations of demand and marginal revenue, and demand and marginal revenue might change. We've got D1, MR1, D2, MR2, etc., D3, MR3, all these which can be due to either declines in demand or declines in supply, either one, or I'm sorry, increases in supply, which can force the price down. But here's the thing, assuming that these are all things happening on the market side of things, and that we're simply along for the ride, the firm's got to ask itself, at what point do we keep producing, at what point do we stop producing? And so as a result, let's take a look at average variable cost and then average total cost. Okay, average variable cost, average total cost, which looks something like that, right? Remember, it gets a little narrower as we get going a little bit here. And so as a result, what's going to happen? We can now overlay the marginal cost curve with it, like right here, okay? So at D1, the firm is actually losing money, but does it stop producing? Let's say actually we start with some D0, okay? Some D0, D0, MR0. So here, the firm wants to produce this level out because price is here and average total cost is there. That's positive economic profit. That's good. That's good for us. We want to do that. But as the price falls, the output level will fall. Well, isn't that what a supply curve is telling us? Remember, from back in chapter 3, we said if the price goes down, quantity supplied goes down, and it will. So as the price falls, the firm will dial down its production of output. And it will do it even below average total cost, meaning that it will lose money per unit, but it will hang in there. It will go all the way down to average variable cost right here. And this is a point called the shutdown point. And this is a little bit confounding because if this is the break even right here, right? That's the break even point where price equals average total cost. And right here, we're above break even, that's good. Here we're below break even, but we're still producing, we're producing all the way down to the shutdown point, which is where price equals average variable cost. So why would we do that? Why would we shut down at the break-even point instead of the shutdown point? And why do we call that shutdown point? The idea is that this is a perhaps temporary condition. As long as the firm can keep producing and at least covering its average variable costs, which are things like materials and labor primarily, they can keep the doors open for some time. As to the fixed costs, which is the difference between average variable cost and average total cost, are the fixed costs, right, per unit. Maybe we can renegotiate lease terms with equipment lessors, or renegotiate rents on premises, or renegotiate our credit terms with lenders, all of those kinds of things, to the extent that that's possible. I'm not saying it's always and everywhere possible, but those are considerations. In other words, why stop producing? Because if we stop producing, we've got a serious problem. And that is, if we stop producing at break even, what if the price pops back up to D0 and we're leaving money on the table because we shut down prematurely? Let's write it down to D2, because at least we will keep the doors open, pay the light bills, pay our workers, pay our suppliers of goods and of raw materials or whatever we're using to produce the good we're making or service, and we're keeping the doors open. But if we fall below that, there's no point, because we can't pay workers, we can't pay suppliers, and so we will shut down at that point. The idea being that maybe at some point, the price, which is now fallen from D2, maybe keeps on going to D3, right? That maybe we will be able at some point to capture a rise in the price back to some D1, D0, something like that, and therefore we can re-enter the market at that point. In other words, if entry is easy, then let's do it. However, the problem is, maybe we're being a little bit overly optimistic when we talk about the ease of entry and exit, because the reality is, which is why the shutdown point is so low here, is that how easy is it to restart in actuality? In other words, when the rubber hits the road, what are the challenges? Call workers back. Workers really don't like to be laid off and then call back, then laid off again and call back. I mean, that doesn't really work. And you can't just hire a worker for 2 years, then lay them off for a year and a half, hire them back for another 3 years, lay them off for another year. Workers are going to probably move on and say, I can't work for you because I can't be assured of anything with your situation. And it does happen. I'm not saying it never is a case in which workers will do that, particularly in an area where maybe there aren't very many jobs available. Maybe they have no choice. But you get the idea, and we'll call that a monopsonistic, which is a single buyer, perhaps one big employer in a certain area where workers go along for the ride. But that's not very common, really. It's not really very common. So shutdown is considered to be an important issue. So, all right, so what's the wrap up here? And then we'll move on to monopoly. And that is this: the long-run economic profit condition is where profit is zero. In other words, it's where price equals marginal revenue. Price equals marginal revenue, which we know before from earlier, which equals marginal cost. It's the same basic idea. This is from a total standpoint, total economic profit, i.e. zero in the long run, but it's also where price equals marginal revenue, which equals marginal cost, which, by the way, also equals average total cost, doesn't it? So, which also equals average total cost, because marginal revenue always equals marginal cost. So as a result, these relationships hold, and that is the long-run economic condition, given the fact that all these short-run runarounds where it's up, down, and for producers of goods in which there is the fluctuation, oil being the one I think that is most easily apprehensible to a lot of us. We see it happen in our daily lives. Price goes up, price goes down, and we just simply are bobbing along with the tide. We have no choice but to take the price if we're a seller. Okay? All right, so that pretty much does it for perfect competition. Are there questions for me from anybody who is remaining on the line here? Okay, well, we've got about 10 minutes, and I want to talk about the. If you do have questions, just get with me. Feel free to email me or whatever, or call me, stop by, whichever, and we can talk more about it. I do want to talk about Chapter 9, which deals with monopoly. So what did I say at the outset of today? And it's something I've been saying before is the fact that of those four structures, the first two, perfect competition and monopoly, you can pretty much take every characteristic of perfect competition and flip it around on its head, and it will define monopoly. It's that different. It's that much of a contrast between the two. So from the week 10 PowerPoint package that I emailed everybody, what is the definition of monopoly? It's basically a single firm supplying all or nearly all of the market's output. All the industry output in a particular good. Now, what does that mean by nearly all? Because doesn't that sort of violate the idea of mono being one producer? It doesn't really, because there are some examples, and I'm going to talk about a couple of historical examples, probably on Wednesday, because we will get to it, which are cases, really perfect cases in my mind of monopolies, where each producer, whether it's Standard Oil from the late 1800s to Microsoft in the late 1900s, where these firms had never really more than 90% market share in the particular product in which they were accused of being a monopoly. And when I say accused, that is an actual correct terminology, because there were legal actions taken against both Standard Oil and Microsoft for monopoly formation. Because here's the deal with monopolies. There were a series of laws passed beginning around 1890 called antitrust laws. Antitrust today is really a separate area of the law. It's a specialty area of the law. The U.S. Justice Department has got an entire division called the Antitrust Division, which goes after firms that are trying to monopolize, because monopoly formation is considered to be illegal. And 1890 was the year of what's called the Sherman Act. We're going to come back to this a bit later, because it was the Sherman Act, there was the Clayton Act, and we'll talk about both of those a bit later as we get into the discussion, which I think is chapter 12, of regulation as a result of legislation, that is laws being passed. So the Sherman Act, which was the very first one, said it's illegal to form combinations whereby there's actions in restraint of trade. That was the language in the law, actions in restraint of trade, which is pretty broad, pretty undefined, and it's taken many, many court decisions to, in federal court and the Supreme Court, to sort of standardize and codify what that means, that in restraint of trade. And there are all kinds of nuances to that. And I don't want to focus so much on the legalities of that. I am not an attorney, so there are areas that I'm not going to be able to speak authoritatively on, but instead to talk really about the economics of it. And that is, monopoly formation does a lot of things to markets, which distort output and income and wealth distribution. And so as a result, they are a bit problematic, which is why they're so very heavily regulated. But yet, in both cases, the two that we talked about with nearly all, neither Microsoft nor Standard Oil had more than 90% of market share. There again, if you think back about what market share is simply this: it's a percentage. And that percentage is simply the total revenue of the firm divided by the total revenue of the market or industry. Again, market and industry being interchangeable terms. So it's a dollar figure divided by a dollar figure, which is going to give us a percentage. So that's what's going on. And neither of those firms, Standard Oil or Microsoft, ever had 90% of the market or more. Now, in Microsoft's case, it's a little bit more complicated than Standard. Standard was basically producing, was a refiner of oil. Microsoft did a lot of things, even at the time that it was the famous antitrust trials, but it was particularly the browser, the internet browser, which was at issue there. That was the really big thing. And the entire operating system that was called into question as a result of that. So what are some of the characteristics of monopoly? Well, if I've sort of sold this as being the polar opposite, as the North Pole to the South Pole of perfect competition, then what are some of the characteristics? There's one single producer that dominates the market. Extremely high firm market share. 90% is pretty close to being dominant. And by the way, when we get into talking a bit more about these giant industrial behemoths, we'll talk about the way that we measure the strength of those particular firms. And so we'll see that how monopolies, even at 90%, is completely off the charts and is mostly unprecedented, but it would really characterize a monopoly condition. There are few or no substitutes that exist for the good. So whatever the good in question is, few substitutes exist. That could be one example of monopoly, where There really is no substitute for that particular good. And by the way, there are goods in which there are substitutes, but the demand side is so loyal to the particular good that they perceive that there are no real substitutes for that good, and hence they'll pay monopoly prices, even if the firm itself is not an actual true monopoly. And there are some examples of that, like Apple products are considered to be very heavily demanded by its consumer base, its worldwide consumer base, who are willing to pay, pay up for the product. They're pretty expensive products, but there's an entire fan following of Apple devotees, and so as a result, they can command something like monopoly price. It doesn't necessarily make them a monopoly because none of the products that they sell are the only products in that particular space, but they do have a sort of monopoly pricing ability, and that's a factor we'll get to a bit more, particularly as we talk about the other imperfectly competitive industries that have occasional monopoly pricing power if they're not de facto monopolies in and of themselves. Okay, so there is that particular issue there. Another example, one example I could talk about is of a firm that's not a monopoly, but it sort of has monopoly pricing, is that of Harley Davidson. And this is one that I wouldn't have thought of. I had a CEO of one of the companies that I worked for who was just a huge admirer of Harley Davidson. And by talking about the fact that they've created an extremely strong, almost impenetrable brand name that really nobody's unseating its particular power in the market, and people are willing to pay more for those particular products. Now, obviously, it's a quality product, and so, but does it justify the higher price? Well, it depends on who's willing to pay the price. Remember that we all experience different amounts of utility for different goods, and they've definitely been able to convince the buy side of the market, the demand side, that the products are worth what they are. And they, one thing that impressed my boss, my CEO, was the idea they've got this huge fan following where people get together and have, rallies and get-togethers. There's a Harley Owners Association. I think it's called Harley Owners Group, HOG, Hog, or Harley Owners Group. So it's the effort to do that. I know Jeep is trying to sort of replicate that with that sort of fanaticism, if you like. Maybe that's too strong a word. With a little bit of success, maybe not quite that much success. It's high, almost insurmountable barriers to entry and exit as well. So these are difficult markets to get into generally. And when we talk about monopolies, and let's not think so much about motorcycles and computers and phones and all that, but think about, because those are just examples of monopoly pricing, fanaticism for the particular good. But instead, when we talk about monopolies, we're talking about markets that are difficult to get in. So if it's a monopoly market, how easy is it to enter a market? Now, one monopoly we're going to be talking a lot about are local utility markets around the country, whether it's electricity, natural gas, water, where it's almost impossible to compete simply because the costs are way too high. Remember, when we talked about barriers to entry, we gave some examples, and the number one example was cost. It's just so darn expensive to start a competing electric company. If somebody wanted to come into Albuquerque and start a competitor to P&M, think about the enormous cost starting out with zero market share. Zero divided by whatever the market is equals zero, and that's a difficult proposition. So high barriers to entry, also high barriers to exit, because once you're in, you're pretty much in. So if you're in the electric business, you're not going to convert your electric utility to something else generally. Okay, so that's a good stopping point for right now. We'll stop at barriers to entry and exit. We'll pick up these characteristics on Wednesday. We'll also get into some of the graphing, and particularly the issue of marginal revenue, how that's going to differ from monopoly and the other imperfectly competitive structures differ from perfect competition, that is. So have a great night. I'll see you next time.